Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. On behalf of the Leo Baeck Institute London, I'd like to welcome you to the penultimate lecture in this year's lecture series, which is held in cooperation with the German Historical Institute London, just down the road. Unfortunately, the deputy director of the institute, Michael Schei, who was due to be here this evening, is unfortunately ill and sent his apologies. I think he might be here on Zoom, in which case, hello, Michael, thank you for joining us. And we thank the German Historical Institute London for their support and cooperation. It's a great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Kai Schiller. Professor Schiller is an expert in modern European history and a renowned scholar, in particular, of 20th century Germany. His research spans the cultural and sports history of Germany, also modern German Jewish history, and the histories of both the Federal Republic and the German Democratic Republic. And he currently holds the chair in modern European history at Durham University. Professor Schiller has published widely on German sports history, including co-editing volumes on the history of the FIFA World Cup and co-authoring the award-winning monograph, the 1972 Munich Olympics and the Making of Modern Germany, published in 2012. His most recent book, published in 2022, is a biography of German Jewish sprinter, anti-fascist activist, and post-war journalist and teacher Alex Natan, who we will be hearing more about in this evening's lecture. Professor Schiller has held numerous prestigious fellowships, including at the Humboldt University in Berlin, the Technical University in Dresden, and at the Institute for Contemporary History in Munich. His current research, in collaboration with Udi Carmi, looks at the influence of German sports models on sports in Palestine and Israel, focusing on the Zionist sports functionary Emmanuel Ernst Simon. In addition to his academic work, Professor Schiller is also an England athletics qualified running coach and a former FA qualified football referee, which I think shows that his passion for sports extends beyond the scholarly realm. I could say much more, but I'm sure you'd rather hear from Professor Schiller. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Kai Schiller. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me and for this kind introduction. Joe and I have a history that goes way back. Joe used to be an undergraduate at Durham University, and I had the pleasure of teaching him a course in Jewish German history or German Jewish history, which I actually taught first in this building, just in the other wing when I was a lecturer at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies when it was still here. So it's an extra pleasure to be here, to be able to lecture here, and to have been invited by Joe. And I'm really, really glad that he's the director of the Leo Baeck Institute of London now. Right. While an extraordinary man, in my opinion, Alex Natan has not achieved anything out of the ordinary, neither as an athlete, nor as an anti-fascist activist, nor as a journalist and literary scholar, nor as a schoolmaster. He was not standing out in any of those fields, but was there or thereabouts in everything he did, like most of us. He was a figure of the second tier, if you wish, as a sportsman, a journalist and writer, and literary historian. Nowadays, he's largely forgotten and unknown beyond specialists in the history of German athletics, sports journalism, and literary criticism. Nevertheless, I believe that Natan is worth writing about by cultural historians, as his life was shaped dramatically by the times he lived in. Moreover, his is a transnational biography, as while he experienced his formative years during a particularly turbulent period of German history, he spent most of his life in Britain. This involved specific ruptures which are worth studying. My main point is that Natan's story reflects the intense political tensions as well as the rapid cultural and social changes characteristic of 20th century European classical modernity. Moreover, while he had to endure a lot of hardship in his life, he never saw himself as a victim. He's also therefore exemplary of how an individual could successfully navigate the obstacles thrown at him during the age of extremes, in Eric Hobsbawm's famous terminology. Of course, this is not to belittle the tens of millions of Europeans who fell victim of war and genocide during that age. And we are again living in uncertain times with the Great War perhaps looming on the horizon. And Natan's fighting spirit, his resilience and adaptability in the face of a great many challenges may well serve us as an example. Finally, his biography provides us with windows into more general issues of German and British history: sport, art, the history of sexuality, especially homosexuality, anti-fascism, political exile, and internment, to name just the most relevant in his case. This is because of the variety of social circles in which Natan moved at various points in his life. Okay, weird. Okay, right. In terms of these circles, for me, there was first Natan's involvement in the world of German athletics as a sprint ace. This world was embodied by Karl Diem, the key figure in German sports from the Empire to the early Federal Republic and chief organizer of the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Natan did not meet him in the Weimar Republic in the interwar period, but he had an extensive correspondence with Diem after World War II. In it, he urged Diem to come clean about his involvement with the Nazi regime. Until the end of his life, Diem denied that he played any role in facilitating the dictatorship. Another important figure for German sport, and for Natan in particular, was the sports general Walter von Reichenau, an early Nazi party soldier and later war criminal during Operation Barbarossa. Reichenau was responsible for getting Natan kicked out of German mainstream athletics in early 1931. This happened when Natan, along with other bourgeois athletes, openly agreed to participate in the Second International Spartakiad. This was organized by the Communist Red Sports International for the summer of 1932 in Berlin. While the event was eventually banned for political reasons, Natan's exclusion from the local athletics federation was never rescinded, despite the fact that he mounted a legal challenge. But first, a few words to situate Natan within the theme of this lecture series. I said that Natan moved in a variety of circles. I would argue that he was never fully part of any of these, either by choice or because they didn't want him to be a part of. Natan was the quintessential outsider. He was arguably the type that the Jewish German literary scholar Hans Meyer made the subject of one of his better-known books, Outsiders. In Außenseiter, Meyer identifies three groups of outsiders in 19th and 20th century Germany, for whom the promise of the Enlightenment, of the free development of the individual, was not realized: women, queers, and Jews. This was because their self-realization would have gone against the core tenets of male bourgeois society. For Meyer, therefore, the Enlightenment project had failed altogether. When discussing the philosophy of hope of the Marxist Ernst Bloch, who saw history from the Enlightenment onwards as the story of an unbroken hope in the emergence of a classless society, Meyer criticized Bloch's disregard for the subjectivity of outsiders. He emphasized the helplessness of Bloch's philosophy, quote, when faced with solitudes which aren't shared by the collective, unquote. Natan certainly experienced these solitudes as a double outsider. He was a queer man and a Jew. Though apart from being bar mitzvahed and his burial on a Jewish cemetery, there's nothing to suggest that he cared much about Judaism. He was also a liberal intellectual, which arguably made him a triple outsider in the eyes of fascists and anti-Semites, German and British homophobes, and the anti-intellectualism of the world of sport. As a 20th century liberal intellectual, Natan embodied a civil ethos and individualist cultural habitus during a time when collectivist ideas and organizations were in the ascendancy. While he had no qualms mingling with left-wing athletes and expressing support for their anti-fascism, he found neither communism nor nationalism, including Jewish nationalism, particularly attractive ideologies. That said, he could also be a pragmatist, responding to the needs of the moment. A good example for this is his relationship to the military. Natan detested German militarism and spoke out openly against the creeping militarization of German sport during the Weimar Republic by figures such as Diem and von Reichenau. Due to the limitations imposed on the German military in the Versailles Treaty and the rise of paramilitary groups, sports in Germany often became Wehrsport, a surrogate for military training, a Wehrersatz. For Natan, sport was to remain a means of enjoyment and not to be functionalized for political purposes. In reaction, as a sportswriter, in the early 1930s, he regularly criticized paramilitary exercises disguised as sports festivals by a group like the SR, for instance. In 1932, the widely read liberal weekly Das Tagebuch published a highly critical essay under his name entitled Sports Fascism. This took a lot when you can gather what this is about, you know, the sort of instrumentalization of sports by political groups, particularly by the right. This took a lot of courage because with it he went against the entire German sports establishment. It also made him a target for the Nazis. This, rather than being Jewish, was the main reason he left Germany soon after 30 January 1933. However, despite this critique of paramilitary sport, Natan was no naive pacifist. In the 1930s, he coached the British Army athletics team and volunteered for military service after Hitler had started the war. He did so unsuccessfully because of his sexual orientation, and although queers were no rarity among British officers and other ranks. Let's look at a few photographs of the man, which I believe can be seen to underscore some of the points on Natan being an outsider and individualist. And if you disagree with my readings, at least you get an idea of his physical appearance. Alex Natan in his Sunday suit, Norfolk jacket, knickerbockers, with his brother by his side. You can see him here at front, younger brother on his side, and smoking mother opposite in the posh sitting room of the family's elegant flat in Berlin-Schöneberg, along with Charlottenburg, obviously the epitome of a bourgeois Jewish quarter in the German capital. This will have been taken towards the end of the First World War when he was maybe roughly 12 years old, with, I personally think, his individualism shining through already in his posture and gaze into the camera. Let's move on a few decades. A seemingly staged photograph from 1948 as a 42-year-old, a well-dressed writer and confident intellectual behind his typewriter from his time at King's School, then in Worcester, then a semi-independent grammar school in the Midlands. And I apologize that the resolution for the next one isn't particularly good. a group photograph of the teachers of King's School, Worcester, again undated, but probably from the early 1960s. He's sitting second on the right here in the front row, and I would argue seemingly uncomfortable and taking a rather defensive posture with his knees pressed tightly together, no smile, and his lips tightly shut, possibly holding a folder of papers towards his chest. But in my opinion, he looks the least comfortable here of all the pictures, of all the teachers in the picture. But maybe that's because of the bench he's sitting on. We have no idea. Anyway, but I thought it's sort of, you know, he appears to me as an outsider on this picture as well, as an individualist. Alex Natan was born, Heinz Alexander Natan, in Berlin on the 1st of February, 1906. He came from a non-converted, but non-religious, assimilated and well-to-do, as well as a very well-connected family of the Berlin Jewish upper middle class. Well-connected, less so because of his father, who owned a women's fashion business in the Konfektionsviertel in Berlin-Mitte, but through his mother, who hailed from the well-known Flechtheim family of grain merchants in Münster, which is best known for Natan's grand-uncle, Alfred Flechtheim, on the upper left here. Flechtheim was a famous and well-heeled Berlin art dealer and gallerist who introduced French modern art to the German public. At one point, he owned the largest private Picasso collection in Germany. A thorn in the eye of the Nazis, Flechtheim was also queer and had to emigrate. He died in London in 1937. As a sports fan, especially of boxing, he created the ironic but fitting epithet according to which his grandnephew was, quote unquote, the fastest Jew in Germany. Moving on the margins of Flechtheim's circle of avant-garde artists, painters, and sculptors like George Kosts, Georg Kolbe, and Rudolf Belling, Natan, while still very young, became something of an insider-outsider, to use Peter Gay's description of avant-garde Weimar culture. His granduncle encouraged him to occasionally write feuilletonist pieces on sport for his magazine Der Querschnitt. And encouraged by Thomas Mann, Natan penned an ironic sports novel, which unfortunately was lost to posterity due to a German bombing. He also befriended the Berlin sculptress and queer new woman, Rene Sintenis. Sintenis was best known for her small-sized sports sculptures, which captured and freeze-framed the movement of famous athletes, like in this case, the flying Finn Paavo Nurmi. And the Querschnitt was a magazine which emphasized the connection between sports and art and modernity, and celebrated this to a great deal via, reproductions of works of art and literary texts which dealt with sport and particularly with boxing. Boxing probably has got most coverage in this magazine. Sports images like this would come from Der Querschnitt. Sports images like these ones in an arts and literary magazine with Sintenis in the middle, and Natan and Karl Getkant, a 400-meter runner, are evidence for what the historian Harold Siegel has termed, quote, the ascendance of the body after the First World War. In this period, all forms of body culture, including English sports, experienced their full breakthrough into German mass culture. This was when membership in sports clubs soared and many sports grounds and representative stadia were built. As a track athlete, Natan represented what was then seen as a distinctly modern form of physical culture. The historian Andrew Denning has emphasized that from the late 19th century onwards, dynamic sports like running and skiing, along with cycling, car racing, and flying, established a new relationship between the individual and nature. This was because they prioritized the free and unhindered movement of the individual. It was that movement that Sintenis captured in her sculptures, along with the sober focus and cool concentration of on the efficient working of the athlete's body. And we could talk a lot about, the economic organization in the early 20th century, what kind of parallels there are with sports as well. In terms of generational cohorts, Natan belonged to the so-called war youth generation, a term often used with reference to members of the functional elite of National Socialism, too young to be sent to the front in the First World War, but old enough to experience the war, the revolution of 1918-19, and the political and economic unrest of the early 1920s, including various putsch attempts and hyperinflation as far-reaching events for their lives. As opposed to Reinhard Heydrich, Albert Speer, all born in 1906, and others who became ardent Nazis, like Natan, born in 1906, these experiences turned Natan into a Republican of reason, to use Friedrich Meinecke's term, and a general skeptic in political matters, as well as, by his own admission, an unfit person in all financial matters. Natan's first major success as an athlete came in 1925, when as an 18-year-old, he came fifth in the 100-meter final of the German Athletics Championship. His greatest achievements, however, were not reached as an individual runner. In 1926 and 1927, he was a member of the German championship-winning 4x100-meter relay team of Phoenix Karlsruhe, with his teammates on the left. You see the Phoenix on the left, and he's the start runner immediately on the left. This was the club which he joined when he was a law and sociology student with Alfred Weber at Heidelberg University. In 1929 and 30, he repeated the feat as third runner with SC Charlottenburg. Here you can see him, the second from the right. In 1929, the SCC squad with Natan even equaled the world record. This meant in effect that his performance peaked 1 year too late to be selected for the German athletics team for the 1928 Amsterdam Olympics. Natan only represented Germany once in an international competition against Switzerland in Basel in 1929. That he was not given more opportunities to compete at international level certainly had to do with that he peaked at the wrong time and did not quite cut the mustard at the highest level. However, he was also left out because of his critical attitude and outspoken nature vis-à-vis the conservative and nationalist German sports establishment, the functionaries, or what he called the Bondsocrats. He was told he was not eligible because of his, quote, independent character, critical attitude, and inability to blindly follow orders. My impression is that Natan was not an easy or pleasant person, or what the Germans call an angenehmer Zeitgenosse. So the behavior of the sports functionaries in wanting to protect themselves from a potential troublemaker was perhaps understandable. After being kicked out of the Bourgeois Athletics Federation in 1931, Natan joined Bar Kochba Berlin, the first and largest Zionist sports club in Germany, for his final season as a sprinter. But not because he strongly believed in National Judaism or political Zionism, but rather because Bar Kochba had a nationally competitive sprint squad, and because the club allowed him to set up a rugby department, a combative sport he seemingly liked a lot. That said, he was not just an opportunist, but was willing to stand up for Jewish causes when necessary. After Bar Kochba successfully participated in a provincial athletics meeting in Rostock in Mecklenburg, where the team was faced with anti-Semitic chants by the audience, he expressed his satisfaction when interviewed by the Jüdische Rundschau, the main Zionist newspaper, quote, that we helped our Rostock brothers who live in an outpost a little in their fight by proving to our countless mortal enemies what Jewish sportsmen are capable of, unquote. Accordingly, the next slide shows Natan as a 25-year-old athlete, a very handsome and exhausted young man in the rest of Bar Kochba Berlin, with the Magen David. Here he has just completed a section of the annual Potsdam Berlin team relay race for Bar Kochba Berlin in 1931 and passed on the baton to one of his teammates. Invented by Karl Diem, the Potsdam Berlin 25-kilometer race for Berlin athletics clubs was one of the main sports events in the capital, with tens of thousands of spectators lining the streets. In popularity, not unlike the Berlin Marathon nowadays. Natan's career as an athlete in the bourgeois and Zionist sports movement demonstrate his outsider status quite clearly, I would argue. While he was too outspoken to be fully accepted in the former, he did not feel Jewish enough for the latter. Aliyah to Palestine, the preparation for which was the aim of the Maccabi sports movement, that's what Bar Kochba trained people for, was certainly never an option for him. After his active career wound down in the fall of 1931, Natan joined the expanding cohort of German sports writers whose articles, due to the popularity of their subject, were read by an estimated 20 million Germans in 1930. He mainly wrote for the Welt am Montag, The World on Monday, a left-wing weekly owned by the German Trade Union Congress. This paper specialized in exposing political scandals, sometimes genuine, sometimes invented, but always with the intention to show the political right and the Nazis especially in as negative a light as possible. While not a member of any political party, Natan wrote for a left-wing paper because he believed that the German organized working class was the only force that could stop the rise of Nazism during the tense and turbulent last years of the Weimar Republic. For this reason, and because there was no social democratic candidate, he also called on German athletes to vote for the Communist Party candidate Ernst Thälmann in the 1932 presidential elections. Natan was also disappointed that the Prussian coup d'etat in July 1932, in which the Social Democrats were removed from power by re-elected President Hindenburg, was not reversed through a general strike on the entire left. This spelled obviously the definite end of the Weimar Republic. His career in journalism is another example of his marginal status, as his bourgeois background and socialization and unideological stance did by no means predispose him to write for a left-wing paper and to put his political hope in the German working class. After Hitler's appointment as chancellor, with his paper banned soon after and facing threats to his personal safety, Natan left Germany, first for Switzerland, and in August 1933 for Britain, where he had relatives. But this was not where his resistance against Nazism stopped. This is really a fabulous story. From exile in London, he supported a group of high-ranking conservative German civil servants who plotted to bring down Hitler as quickly as possible. Using the codename Canterbury, Natan served as their intelligence liaison to Britain. He supplied genuine, uncensored information on current affairs in Nazi Germany for The Week. The Week was a mimeographed newsletter to which the entire British political establishment in this city here subscribed, and which the German ambassador unsuccessfully tried to get banned. The Week was the brainchild of Claude Coburn, also known as Frank Pitcairn, a card-carrying member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. In the process, Natan traveled several times to Germany with false papers, including when the conspiracy was exposed in June 1934, and the men behind it were killed during the so-called Night of the Long Knives. He himself narrowly escaped arrest by the Gestapo and worse. From then on, he eked out a meager living as an athletics and sports coach and language teacher at English provincial public schools in Dorset and the Cotswolds and for the Middlesex Regiment of the British Army. He also matriculated as a postgraduate in sociology at the LSE and wrote a report for the National Fitness Campaign, which was Britain's response to Nazi Germany's Strength Through Joy program on the poor physical condition of Scottish youth. While he knew some prominent emigres from Nazi Germany in London during the 1930s, he mostly kept his distance from them. So he was also an outsider in that respect. After the November pogroms of 1938, he set up a refugee committee for Jewish children from Germany and Austria. In size, the activities of the Dorset Refugee Committee could not compare with Nicholas Winton's famous list. However, he succeeded in getting out a good number of children from 3 to 17 years old out of Germany by finding foster and adoptive families for them and by placing them with local artisans and farmers to prepare them for emigration to Palestine. Among these children was one of Natan's relatives, who was fostered by Harold Abrahams, the Anglo-Jewish 100-meter gold medalist of the 1924 Olympics in Paris of Chariots of Fire fame. After his active career, as you might know, Abrahams became an influential BBC sports broadcaster and athletics organizer. Natan also appointed Abrahams, a solicitor by training, as his legal representative during the hardest time of his life. This was when he was interned for 4 long years after war had broken out in September 1939. Incidentally, when representing Natan, Abrahams did in no way correspond to the image of a Jewish outsider as portrayed in the movie. So I think I even have an image of him. So in the movie, rather he comes across as an establishment figure, apparently embarrassed by Natan's queerness and appearing content that he was locked up. In any event, he did absolutely nothing to get him released. How do we know all this? Right, so the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich keeps a couple of memoirs by Natan on key events of his life, like his involvement with the German resistance and his internment. I supplemented this information with from a variety of other sources which I gathered over the years: state, university, newspaper, radio and private archives, newspaper collections, histories of German and Zionist athletics. And I found a remarkable amount of information through internet searches as so much material has been digitized over the past decades. Finally, I profited immensely from private communications with Natan's surviving relatives and friends whom I was able to trace or who contacted me after hearing about my research. So for example, by getting Natan's will and codicil, I was from Andrew Kaufman here, I was a relative of Natan's. I was able to trace the last surviving partner that Natan had, and who sent me the copy of the family photograph, which you saw at the beginning from the early photograph when he was a young boy. I showed the one I showed you before. So thank you very much again for this help, because that obviously allowed me to fill in some gaps, although there are a lot of gaps still which I wasn't able to fill. Much of the information from 1933 onwards comes from Natan's voluminous Home Office file in the National Archives in Kew. This is because from the moment Natan arrived in Britain, he was, like all other refugees, under constant supervision by the police and MI5. This was because of the fear that he might be a Nazi agent. Remarkably, he was spied on even more once he was expatriated by the Reich and applied for British citizenship in 1938. Then it should have been clear to all concerned that he was no more than a Jewish refugee. Natan was unsuccessful with this application, and 2 further ones in 1946 and 1949, without ever finding out why. This was because references from employers and acquaintances, while praising his qualities as a coach and teacher, pointed out that he had serious character flaws, without, however, explaining what these were. The responsible MI5 officer, Robin Tin-Eye Stevens, saw through the reticence of Natan's referees to write openly what bothered them. Quote, "I think we would probably arrive at the true facts of this case, namely that this man is a homosexual. unquote. That Natan was queer was a welcome reason to also immediately detain him as a so-called enemy alien when the war broke out in September 1939. For that reason, I would argue, he was also held for much longer than almost all other Jewish refugees. He spent 48 months in often very primitive conditions in internment camps in Seaton in Devon, in Clacton-on-Sea, after deportation to Canada in the wilderness of Quebec, and finally on the Isle of Man. Stevens had recommended to, quote, deny him opportunities for perversion as a schoolmaster, which I'm sure you won't be able to read, but this is what it says right here. At times he was locked up with Nazis, for example, German merchant mariners arrested by British authorities, who were usually treated better than Jewish refugees because you could trade them for British POWs, for example. Yeah, so life was really hard for him in those years, particularly in Canada. He was eventually released in 1943 after, in his words, 34,669 hours of unstoppable torment, unquote, with the proviso that in case of a German invasion, which at that point nobody seriously expected anymore, he would be immediately reinterned. He was only let go because as a stateless person, remember he had lost his German citizenship, his internment was legally unsafe in the first place, and the Home Office feared a challenge in the courts. Natan came out at the other end in good mental health, mainly because he maintained his personal dignity by resisting the camp authorities in small ways throughout. For example, he refused to have his hair cut and engaged the camp commander in a drawn-out correspondence about his appearance. To cope and cultivating his outsider status also in this situation, he also used his experiences to write a combined sociology, psychology, and sexology of internment camp life, fragments of which survive in manuscript form. However, his physical health had suffered significantly during those 4 years. It's likely that the long-term internment contributed to his untimely early death when he was only 64. Surprisingly, or maybe not, despite his sexual orientation, he quickly found employment after his release as a history master at King's School in Worcester, which was closely linked to the Church of England's Worcester Cathedral, and still is, I think. However, he continued to be watched by the security services long into the 1950s, because he might be a communist spy. Yeah, not a Nazi spy, but a communist spy. Natan stayed in Worcester for the next 24 years, but he was no normal teacher. This was because in the post-war period, he also resumed his career as a journalist, writing for several mainstream West German papers, like the Tagesspiegel, Die Zeit, and the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, as well as for Südwestfunk Baden-Baden. Natan effectively had 2 full-time jobs. Reflecting the breadth of his interests, he wrote on all kinds of British topics, including a lot on sports. He often had to deal in the process with sports editors whom he knew from the 1920s and 30s, many of whom had been deeply implicated in the Nazi regime, some as members of the SS. But because he wanted to have a career as a journalist, he had to compromise. He also wrote and edited books on football, German and English literature, on post-war Germany and Britain, on opera, including on his favorite composer Richard Strauss, and history. Compared to what he experienced in Weimar Germany and in England in the 1930s and 40s, his post-war life in Britain was considerably less eventful. On the 14th of January, 1971, Alex Natan died from heart disease in St. John's Wood in London. He was cremated and his ashes were scattered on the Hoop Lane Jewish Cemetery in Golders Green. I've briefly discussed 2 of the social circles within which Natan moved in the Weimar Republic, that of sport and that of the Querschnitt. I want to end my presentation by mentioning some further social circles in which he was involved during his time in England in the 1930s. Again, I would argue Natan remains something of an outsider in all of them. And I've reproduced some some photographs of important figures in those circles, most of whom were also queer or bisexual and whose lives intersected with his. There was first the so-called emigrantezza, prominent German exiles in London and the south of England, represented here on the left, top left, by Rudolf Olden, liberal lawyer and journalist and former political editor of the Berliner Tageblatt, whom Natan knew in London, and whose wife Ika Alpan accused Natan of being a Nazi spy, which will have reinforced MI5 suspicions. The Oldens drowned in September 1940 in the North Atlantic when their ocean liner to the US was torpedoed by a German U-boat. Then, to the right here, is Wolfgang Ganz Edler zu Putlitz, a close friend of Natan's in the early years of his exile, until they fell out for an unknown reason. Putlitz headed the consular section of the German embassy in London, and along with Klopp von Ustinov, incidentally, Peter Ustinov's father, provided MI6 with secret information, for example, on the numbers and deployment plans of the German army. Putlitz was a witness in the Wilhelmstrasse war crimes trial against members of the Foreign Office, later emigrated to the GDR. Then there was Hans Siemsen, top row on the right, a left-wing journalist and friend of Regis Sintenis, with whom Natan and his young partner, John Strick, that was Natan's lover, spent the summer of 1938 in Sanary-sur-Mer in the south of France. Sanary served as a temporary refuge for Erika and Klaus, and Thomas and Katja Mann, Leon and Magda Feuchtwanger, Franz Werfel and Alma Mahler-Werfel, Arnold Zweig, Hans Saal, and many others. John Strick had a sexual relationship with Siemsen's partner, Walter Dickhaut, who had inspired him to write the semi-documentary novel Die Geschichte des Hitlerjungen Adolf Goers about homosexuality in the Hitler Youth. And this book was meant to discredit the Nazis because of its content. It only came out in Germany way long after the war, but in England, it came English translation with Klaus Mann's help, came out in 1940 and actually became quite famous. It gets better than that. Sorry, what did I do now? Did I switch it off? No, here we are, right. Jack McNamara, who is here on the left, second row on the left, was a commanding officer of the London Irish Rifles, an army regiment, and Tory MP, was one of the politicians who was instrumental in making the political establishment in Britain abandon appeasement of Nazi Germany in the late 1930s. He was initially sympathetic to the Nazi regime, but changed his mind after a guided visit to Dachau, and perhaps because of what Natan told him. Natan taught him German, so he and his personal assistant, Guy Burgess, of the Cambridge 4 spies, no less, would find it easier to communicate with rent boys during sexual excursions to Germany. McNamara was killed in action in 1944 during the Allied invasion of Italy. Hubertus von Löwenstein, right next to him, was a journalist for Olden's Berliner Tageblatt and author and a famous figure of the German anti-fascist resistance, who helped writers and intellectuals who had fled Nazi Germany, including Hans Siemsen, to get to the US to the so-called American Guild for American Freedom, for German Freedom, Cultural Freedom, an aid organization he had founded. Von Löwenstein was bisexual and in love with John Strick, to whom he suggested that he should abandon Natan once Natan had been interned, which he did to Natan's chagrin. Strick, who served under McNamara, also fell during the Allied invasion of Italy. And there's a portrait of him in King's College. He used to be a King's College history student, where he is celebrated, where his sacrifices is celebrated. Bernhard Weiss, the next on the right, another prominent figure of German history, the Weimar Republic, the former police vice president, Jewish police vice president, who had fled to London, was famous for his legal tussles with Joseph Goebbels when he was the Gauleiter of Berlin. Weiss and Natan were interned at the same time in London's Olympia Exhibition Center, incidentally, along with Hitler's foreign press chief, Ernst Putzi Hanfstaengl, who had also fled Germany. Weiss, who was quickly released, unsuccessfully attested to Natan's anti-fascist credentials. And finally, in the bottom right corner, someone Natan met during internment in Canada. This was Anton Diffring, who probably was his lover. The Austrian Diffring became a well-known film actor after the war, who ironically often played Nazis in British productions after the war. He's perhaps most famous for being cast as opponent of Oskar Werner's Montag in François Truffaut's adaptation of Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. So much for opening a few more windows into the history of exile and emigration and anti-fascism in Britain. Let me briefly return to my main point. With the example of Alex Natan, I hope to have shown the relevance of questions of belonging and not belonging during the age of extremes. These questions continue to be significant in our own time, given the continued importance of or resurgence of exile and emigration, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, extreme nationalist and religious ideologies, populist politics, toxic masculinity, hatred, violence, and war. Thank you very much.
So much, for this wonderfully clear, expository kind of lecture that reminded me very much of lectures in Durham. It's part of the reason why I'm here today. So thank you. Raised all sorts of so many fascinating themes, and I'm sure people in the audience have questions. We can also take questions from those of you who are watching on Zoom. Either you can type them into the chat or possibly speak them out, in which case please raise your virtual hand. But it might be easier to start with a question from the room if anyone has one. Yes. Do we have a microphone that we can?
I think I can talk.
No, okay, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much for the fascinating lecture, but an absolutely fascinating biography about which I knew nothing. With regard to the question of belonging and alienation, I find myself asking, what were his relationships with his family like through all these years? And what was the fate of the family? Did the brother get out? Did the parents get out? And sometimes, of course, in a situation where one is an outsider, the family provides a refuge.
Yeah, he got his family out just I think a few days before the outbreak of war, but it was very, very hard to get visas to come to Britain, but he managed. I think he managed because he had he'd actually looked after an athletics team which was sent from Salem to Britain, like a school team. He had looked after that team, and they had had a reception with the king. And a photograph was taken of this, and it was published in the papers. And his mother could go to the British consul in Berlin and say, "Listen, my son had a reception with the king. I need a visa to get out." And he managed. His parents managed to get out. They emigrated first to Brazil, but then his actually, and then his mother came back from Brazil, and he lived with relatives in London. It's an interesting story because a sister of Alma Flechtheim, his mother, was married to a British man and a British merchant, and I think was also in the grain business, if I'm not mistaken. And they stayed, so they had a connection to Britain. Natan had a connection to Britain as well. So and for that reason they came to Britain. And he was extraordinarily close, not to his father, who died relatively early in exile in Brazil. He could not stay in Britain. He just had a transit visa to go to Brazil. His mother was able to come back. His father died in Brazil. He maintained a very close relationship with his mother throughout his life, and who then lived also in Golders Green. His brother, his brother also had emigrated to Brazil. He did not have a good relationship with his brother. So they had a falling out, I think. But again, he had a good relationship with his brother's son, whom I tried to trace, but I was unable to find him. But I found some documents through some researcher in Brazil in their national archives. So I knew that he existed. But he was very close to his mother throughout, and I'm sure that was a very important sort of help for him, as well as a kind of responsibility as well. You know, you can see some of the letters that some of the correspondence in which he writes about his mother, both as a burden and as a pillar of support. Yeah, so that was, I think, a very important constant in his life, no doubt about it. Yeah. Good.
Thanks, Guy. It's not so much a question, I still request for information. I was intrigued to see what kind of footage on your screen.
Yes.
Because I've been working on him, and in his papers and in his various memoirs, the name never features. What is that based on? Do you have correspondence?
I found correspondence where
from what period?
From the early 30s, 34, 35, when he was in London. I just found correspondence which talks about the dinner party, at Natan's, and the falling out, though it's never quite explained, what the falling out was about. He also went often to, I think one of the reasons why he was suspected of being a German spy, he often went to see Putlitz in the embassy. So if refugees went to the German embassy, they were often potentially seen as...
But Putlitz was an informer. Putlitz was an informer of the British Secret Service since 35.
I understand, but nobody knew that, right?
Well, the Foreign Office knew.
Yes, but the German emigre community did not know this. So if somebody went to the German embassy, like Natan did often, to meet up with Putlitz, he was immediately considered as somebody who might be a Nazi spy or Nazi informer. But that's the only, I only found one reference to them being friends, essentially.
And the connection with Burgess?
I don't think he met Burgess in person, although I'm not sure about this. He might have met him as well.
Because Putlitz knew Burgess as well from
yes.
friends onwards, and
yes.
internet
yes.
as well.
Yes, queer networks. Yeah, absolutely understandable. Yeah, I'm sure, but I could not find. I also thought, like, McNamara was the important person for me because he was the direct contact, and then there's a whole range of other people connected, the very prominent people, for example, Harold Nicholson, a friend of McNamara's, a protector of Natan's lover, John Strick, who famously married to, what's her name? Rita Sackville West, is part of that broader circle. There's a fabulous book by the Labour MP, Chris Bryant, called The Glamour Boys, which discusses the shift from appeasement to resistance against Nazi Germany in Britain in politics, and looks at especially queer MPs such as Nicholson and McNamara and others in sort of shifting opinion in the Conservative Party from appeasement to rearmament and preparing for war with Germany. And it's a very, very interesting, I think, sort of group of people that he's written about.
I'm very struck by the fact that when you discuss Natan's internment, the reason for his internment, that he was category A, he was interned immediately at the war, he was interned so long, you don't mention at all the connection with Dora Farber and Matilda
Right,
Roy.
I didn't discuss that case. You're absolutely right. He was suspected of being involved in the murder-suicide of nobody knows quite. Are you Trump? Yes, she is. Okay, right. So you've written about this extensively, so you know the story. My impression is that yes, I think he made mistakes when he was interviewed, but he was not involved in any way in this affair.
If he hadn't gone to the police and said that he'd spoken to Dora Farber before the death, nobody would actually know the connection.
Yes,
As it was, he highlighted himself.
that may be the case. So it's a story for others in the room who don't know the story. The story is that Dora Fabian, who was the secretary of Ernst Toller, yeah, the writer, playwright, so there's another prominent person here, whom we know from the Weimar Republic, left-wing writer, dramatist, was found dead along with, what was her name again?
Matilda Roy.
Matilda Wurm, who was an SPD Reichstag deputy who had fled to Britain, and they lived together, and they were found dead in a flat in Bloomsbury, around the corner from here probably. I don't know the address. And Natan was a friend of Dora Fabian's, and it was not clear whether he was suspected of being involved in the murder. There's also a famous case of a German refugee having been abducted from Switzerland. And there's a very broad history, but I think in the end, I found no evidence whatsoever that would suggest that he was really responsible. He went to the police. I think he wanted to be helpful.
He did.
He wanted to be helpful, and maybe for that reason, it was about whether he had lent her money or not, and there must have been, I don't know, perhaps a misunderstanding. I deal with this extensively in the book, so if you want to read the book, the point is, I don't remember much of the stuff that I've written. I don't know whether other people have the same impressions. Once you've written something, then you don't quite remember all the details anymore, because your mind is now occupied with new research. So anyway, so I can't really tell that story in great detail, but if you want to read it, feel free to do that. But my impression was that he was unjustly sort of suspected of having been involved. I think he had no reason to murder. And there was also, the story is probably more appropriate, at least to women committed suicide, because there was a backstory of Dora Fabian spending Matilda Wurm's money, etc., etc. Yeah, but anyway, so now slowly I start remembering again. But so I didn't mention that because I had to cut out some things, right?
Yes.
So in a lecture like
Just an important aspect.
I thought what really mattered in the end was what the MI5 officer, who was a really powerful man, sorry, this man, Robin Tinai, who interrogated him and was a very unpleasant experience for Natan, what he wrote in his protocol, and you want to stop giving him opportunities for perversion as a schoolmaster, and I therefore suggest internment. Yeah, this seemed to be the main reason why he was locked. In my interpretation of that source, yeah.
That dates from December 39.
Yeah, no, this is when he was interviewed whether he would be released. Okay, so it's another sort of, how do you say, like a Kunstgriff, which I used, I just had to, so maybe he was locked up because he was considered, he was just an A, enemy alien, category A, but he would not be released. And why would he not be released? Because of that. Yeah. So I just swept over this detail because it felt like it didn't matter, like in the course of this lecture. Right. Andrew.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think it's probably confirmation that he regarded himself as an outsider in his life, because he remained stateless, didn't he?
Yes.
He never.
No, not true. No. He got his German citizenship back.
Yes, but he never got British citizenship.
No, but he tried to get British citizenship, but he never knew why, because the Home Office does not need to tell you why you don't get British citizenship.
Yeah.
I, as a historian, can now find out there's a voluminous file, and this is why he never got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would assume. Yeah. Although those specific decisions are not really covered in but I would assume that this is the reason why he didn't get citizenship either. But he tried several times, 39, 46, 49.
I think he spoke to me about it. He resented the fact that he was never properly British.
But did he have any idea of why? No, he didn't. He didn't know. No, right. Yeah.
There is on Zoom.
Yeah. Okay.
Listening to your very, what's the word, kaleidoscopic, I think, to describe.
That's a nice word to put it
It
in.
makes me realise how little I know still about German Jewish history and a little bit about the sport. But a couple of things. This idea of bringing down Hitler from outside Nazi Germany, is it not the subject of a book, The Unnecessary War? When they all get together, there is this idea, they ask for support of the Foreign Office here, of the British government. If you support us, you have got to support us. We will bring down Hitler. And the reply was, that is treacherous, that is traitor, being a traitor, we cannot do that. I've only read snippets from the book, so I don't know how true that is.
I'm not familiar with this now. I don't know whether you.
That was a big debate. That was a big debate in the 60s and 70s, and I think it can be dismissed out of hand. It is quite true that any number of oppositional-minded Germans turned up in London and said, do something, to which the Foreign Office always said, do something yourself. And I think that is pretty much a good argument. So that was never a serious possibility. I mean,
the go-between was Raglan. I live in Burgess Hill. He's buried in Cookfield. He got a lot of information which he passed then to Churchill. He died 38, and he said, sadly, I am dying. I am unable to prevent this war. I think it was a futile. You have to remember that Chamberlain was an anti-Semite. Ramsay MacDonald was an anti-Semite. There's a very clever pun. Chamberlain, Chamberlain. You may have heard that.
No, first time. No. Okay.
And the other thing is, just as an addenda, my printer ran out of ink. I have 15 copies of someone who was an insider, then an outsider, and then allowed to be an insider to compete at the 1936 Olympic Games, and that is Helena Meyer. Such a tragic story. I've got them here, and I've also got a photograph. If you might have one, Professor Schiller, have you seen the one of the winner's rostrum?
Yes, yes.
I've got that here, so I've only got 15 copies, so any more, if you give me your email address, I'll gladly send you one.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, maybe I'll ask a question.
Go ahead.
It does, Natan does appear to be the quintessential outsider in more than one respect. And you mentioned his individual individualism, as contributing to that. The inspiration for this lecture series was actually when I started in this position. I started reading about the founding figures of the Institute, you know, from German Jewish refugees, and sort of realizing that most of them were outsiders in Britain. I read Richard Evans's obituary of Werner Mosse, and you know, in different ways, but they all had this thing in common. So I wonder how much Natan was unusually on the outside, or whether his sort of destiny was or his position as an outsider was shared by many others of this cohort, the German Jewish migrant community.
I'm not sure whether I have a good answer for that. I would have thought that in many ways he was perhaps more of an outsider with respect to the British German Jews having fled to London, to that community, because he never, except maybe for a couple of friendships, he tried to keep his distance from that community. That is very difficult, I think, to compare individual life stories, and then to come to a conclusion how much of an outsider somebody was. It's really more, I think, self-perception.
Yeah.
And so whether and sort of an unwillingness to maybe be part of a group. So if somebody like Richard Evans writes about Werner Mosse as being sort of an outsider, he writes that from a British insider perspective, doesn't he? And so that's, I think, another important aspect of whether Werner Mosse see himself as an outsider. I think you'd have to have ego documents to come to a decision. But I'm sure every refugee will by nature be an outsider, whether it was in the 30s or whether it is today. And the question is, how much of this is chosen? How much of this is just the fact of being from somewhere else or being seen as different? I really don't have
That's
an answer.
got me thinking. I think maybe Natan positioned himself more as an outsider than others who were not outsiders by choice, but had been sort of thrust into that position by virtue of having been forced to flee Germany. Interesting. But there are many different ways in which one can find oneself an outsider.
Yes.
Good. Any further questions from the room or from the Zoom? There was a nice comment that somebody wrote that will remind them of the John le Carre novel. Was it the small town in Germany?
John le Carre.
It does have that feeling. I have a question. This is from Tim Gluckman. Oh no, actually we've got two, sorry. Okay, we've got Michael Shai. Hi Michael. He says, thank you very much for the great lecture. Can you say a bit more about Natan's political views in the latter part of his life? He seems to have mingled with people of all political persuasions, not just communists. He was suspected of communism by the authorities, but did he stick to his communist views, and did Stalinism influence his attitudes?
No, he was a bit like another famous emigre to Britain, whose name I just can't remember at the moment. Famous, very famous. Was a journalist for the Observer. No. Richard Löwenthal. No, not Richard Löwenthal. No. Hafner, Sebastian Hafner, exactly. decidedly anti-communist, anti-Stalinist in the post-war period. Yeah. He was very, very, I mean, everything he wrote in terms of journalism, you could sort of sense this sort of, fear of, West Germany being taken over, yeah, by the Soviets. And he had no sympathy whatsoever for Stalinism. Yeah. So, and after the war ended, if he had been able to vote, which he wasn't in this country, whether he would have voted Labour or Conservative, very difficult to say. I think he would have said maybe he's a one nation conservative or sort of a right-wing social democrat, yeah. Probably switching his allegiances between the two main parties. He had no problems with the British establishment, for example. When he wrote about Oxford, and he made sure that some of the students made it into Oxford or Cambridge. He loved. I think he went to Queen's Tea at some point. He wrote about this for a German newspaper. He very much, as you said yourself, I think he very much wanted to be part of British society and loved Britain for that. And politically, I think I would have probably said it's kind of somewhere in the center, centrist, if you wish. Yeah, and he certainly after the war had no sympathies for the Soviets, had no sympathy for Stalin or for communism anymore. Yeah, Max.
Thank you very much. Just as a follow-up to this previous thought about his post-war history, can you tell us a little bit more? If I understood correctly, you re-established contact with the German press, German press after the Second World War.
Yes.
So how did you manage? Because there he had to deal, of course, with some less than savory characters that you mentioned. Already, of course, the sports functionary indeed.
Yes.
How did that evolve over time? It must be extremely hard.
Yeah. I mean, initially after the war with Diem, he just said, "You are disqualified forever to organize German sports or have anything to do with German youth because of your involvement, because you organized the 1936 Olympics." But Diem was a Christian Democrat. He became director of the German Sports College in Cologne, which is the main German sports university, and continued to influence sports way until the 1960s. He also worked for the Interior Ministry, wrote Persilscheine, sort of denazification, sort of attestations for a lot of athletes who had been involved with Nazism. A lot of these athletes then ended up writing for newspapers, became sports journalists. There seems to be a natural progression. If you're clever and an athlete, then you can become a sports journalist, and then if you can write. So a lot of that happened. And quite a few of them ended up writing for papers which we now consider liberal, arch-liberal, like Die Zeit, for example. But Die Zeit, which is a weekly, was very much a brown paper after the war. And a lot of the journalists who were involved there had a very, very problematic pasts. And nevertheless, nevertheless, this is the other thing. They needed somebody who would report on English sports because he was cheap. Yeah, he was cheap. They couldn't afford a correspondent. Now, these German papers could not, when they started out, they could not afford a correspondent in this country. So Natan would be able to write on football, for example, or on athletics, and he would get something out of it. They would get something out of it. They had to compromise. He had to compromise, and he worked. He, as I said, he was pragmatic enough to accept those people. At the same time, he tried to find out about their pasts. For example, he contacted the Munich Institute for Zeitgeschichte, trying to find out whether they could help him to get access to the files of these people in the Berlin Document Center. Yeah, there's a correspondence between. No, they said no, we're not going to do this for you. Yeah, so he tried to find out what these careers of these people were, and he found out some stuff, but maybe other stuff he didn't find out because he died. A lot of these people are still around in the 70s. They're famous. Sports functionaries from the 30s, 40s were still in important positions in 1972 during the Munich Olympics, in important roles, who had been in the SS, which, you know, only slowly, you know, you see a kind of sort of shift of generations in the German sports administrations as well, you know. So I think he saw it was problematic to work with these people, but I think he clung to being able to write for German papers. That was also part of his sort of identity. He was still very British, but also very interested in sort of maintaining the contact. He traveled to Germany all the time, yeah. And as I said, he had two careers. I think his career as a teacher did not really sort of challenge him very much. He could pretty much do what he liked, you know. He did a lot of that, but then his main career was probably as a sports writer, yeah. And he wrote a lot, yeah.
And I can confirm that because I was with I was 13, I think, at the time. I was with my school in 1960 at the Roman Olympics, and he invited me to the press box there. And I spent the whole day in the press box with him. And I know he was writing for Swiss papers and for German papers.
Yeah. So he was just, yeah. And he also, one of the weirdest discoveries I had was I thought, well, maybe he also wrote for, which I never knew, maybe he also wrote for German radio stations, right? So I wrote to all German, you know, regional radio stations. And do you have any files regarding this and that? And the West from Baden-Baden, yeah, came back to me and said, we have hundreds of scripts, radio scripts, which he had produced on everything and anything, except for German politics. He never wrote about German politics because he's obviously, but he wrote about Britain, the decline of empire, you know, politics, a lot of stuff, which I spent a week there just, you know, photocopying all the stuff that had actually written, these radio scripts. And there's also some some recordings of his voice. At some point he then, usually they were spoken by somebody else. You know, he would send his radio scripts to Baden-Baden and somebody else would speak them. But at some point then he also just spoke them himself. And I think when maybe tape recorders became affordable, or he went to the BBC and recorded something and it was sent to Germany. So I think that was very, very important, but he never thought he would go back. That was probably out of the question. Also, he had no qualifications as a teacher. He had studied law. Yeah, that's another story. He never finished his law studies because he couldn't get his dissertation published because of Nazi opposition to publish his legal dissertation, his PhD in law dissertation, and for that reason he never finished a degree. I think he also didn't finish his LSE degree that he studied for, but he never got a first and second whatever. He got the Staatsexamen, but he never got the yeah.
As we were talking about sport, I mean, he was obviously incredibly prolific because just the book titles you showed illustrate a very broad spectrum.
Yes.
It's obviously talked about, but back to sport, did he remain interested in the Jewish sport movement?
No, I think not at all. I think the Jewish sports movement, Zionism, he had no contacts with any of the Zionist athletes after that time, you know, after 31.
But also, I mean, there was a thriving Jewish sports movement in Britain as well.
Oh yeah, I think the only person with whom he had contact was another Jewish sports writer who was already very famous in the Weimar Republic, Willy Meisel. And that was perhaps also his way. Willy Meisel was the main sports reporter for Ullstein, for the Ullstein press, for a whole variety of illustrated magazines, Vossische Zeitung, and he was, I think, the prototypical sports journalist in the Weimar Republic of Austrian descent, also a former athlete, goalkeeper of the so-called Wonder Team, the Austrian national team, and brother of the coach, Hugo Meisel, and of that team. And Natan, he continued to be friends. but Meisel himself was no Zionist. He was or maybe a cultural Zionist. He never, I think, I'm not sure whether they ever even went to Israel or Palestine after the war. I could not find out. Meisel I would have loved to find out more about Meisel, but there's very little, material for him. There's some material in Cologne, but can't find out very much about him. But that's, I think, the only contact he had to Jewish sports, because Meisel was very closely linked to Maccabi London. Yeah, but it seemed more like an individual friendship than Natan being really closely involved with the Jewish sports movement.
Okay, someone asked a question on Zoom and then said, I withdraw my ill-informed question. But I respect that decision, even though it seemed like a perfectly good question. In which case, if there are no other questions, those of you here in the room with us physically are welcome to join us for a drinks reception afterwards in the Montague Lounge, which is just down the end of the corridor on the left. Those of you who joined online, unfortunately, we won't be able to with you, but thank you very much for your time and attention this evening. And finally, I'd like to thank once again the Professor.
Thank you a lot. Thanks for having me.